Imagine this scene. Mark Carney at a G7 press conference, not in some private room or through a carefully worded statement released hours later, but live, standing at a podium in front of every major world leader, with cameras broadcasting to the entire planet, publicly mocked Donald Trump. The Prime Minister of Canada looked toward the President of the United States and delivered a line that made the entire room, heads of state, diplomats, the International Press Corps, erupt in laughter at him. Within hours, the footage exploded online. Before Trump's plane even left the summit, it had racked up over 90 million views, trended #1 in 43 countries, and spawned a deluge of memes, screenshots, and reaction videos. This wasn't just a moment. It instantly became the defining image of this presidency's fraught relationship with the democratic world. Trump's response? Anything but measured. No strategic counterpunch, no controlled diffusion, just raw, visible, public, unrestrained rage. And every word of it confirmed precisely what Carney had so cleverly implied. According to Warren Buffett, Carney inflicted a unique kind of damage, something no tariff, trade deal, or diplomatic maneuver in this entire confrontation had managed to do. It's damage that won't show up in economic reports, but fundamentally alters the dynamics of every future interaction between the U.S. and the democratic world. But here's the kicker. The precise line Carney delivered, and the 2 seconds of loaded silence before the room exploded in laughter, revealed this was no spontaneous joke. This was a masterclass in strategic execution, brilliantly disguised as humor. Once you understand the meticulous setup, the flawless delivery, the seismic reaction, Trump's furious response, and what Warren Buffett predicts this means for American authority moving forward, you'll grasp why 13 seconds from a press conference podium might have inflicted more damage on the American presidency than 2 years of tariffs, trade wars, and diplomatic crises combined. Stay with me because this story is still unfolding, and the diplomatic repercussions are only just beginning. To truly understand this, we need to go back to the beginning. The setup is just as crucial as the moment itself. What Trump said in the hours leading up to that press conference set the stage for Carney's line to land like a shockwave. The G7 summit in Puglia was already a powder keg. For 3 days, the trade war between the U.S. and its allies had consumed every bilateral meeting, every working dinner, every whispered corridor conversation. Trump arrived embodying the same aggressive, transactional, and openly dismissive posture he'd brought to every international forum for 2 years. He seemed to view the multilateral framework the G7 represented with disdain. The first 2 days were a blur of public berating of European leaders over defense spending, threats of new tariffs on Japanese cars, and hallway declarations to reporters that the G7 was a waste of time, unless other nations started showing some respect for what America does for them. Other leaders responded with their usual practiced diplomatic restraint, a default mode when engaging with Trump at these summits. Polite disagreements, carefully calibrated statements, and private frustrations shared only with trusted staff behind closed doors. Macron was pointed but always measured. MS remained firm but formal. The British Prime Minister in particular maintained strategic silence, avoiding public confrontation entirely. Behind those closed doors, however, where cameras were banned and candor was supposed to thrive, the atmosphere had been steadily worsening. Diplomatic sources painted a picture of Trump dominating conversations, not with arguments but with sheer volume and repetition. He dismissed counter-arguments by simply talking over those who made them, treating the other world leaders not as equals in shared governance, but as subordinates awaiting instructions. Then, on the final morning, during a working session, Trump uttered something about Canada that multiple attendees later called the point of no return. The discussion was ostensibly about trade coordination, and Carney was presenting Canada's meticulously prepared, data-driven framework on supply chain resilience. 14 minutes into his presentation, Trump interrupted. He didn't dispute the data. He offered no counter-argument. Instead, he simply looked around the table and declared, "Nobody cares what Canada thinks about trade. Canada is a small country that's lucky we buy anything from them at all. If it weren't for the United States, nobody in this room would even know where Canada is." The room fell silent. But it wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the stunned quiet of leaders grappling with something so gratuitously dismissive, so beyond the pale, that the usual diplomatic machinery simply couldn't formulate an immediate response. Carney, however, didn't react. His expression remained unchanged, his posture unyielding. 3 direct observers reported he held Trump's gaze for about 4 seconds, with an intensity one Canadian diplomat later called the quietest fury I've ever seen on a human face. Then, without a word, he returned to his notes and continued his presentation, as if no interruption had occurred. He finished, answered questions, participated in the rest of the discussion, and gave absolutely no visible sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened, or was about to. But behind the scenes, the Canadian delegation sprang into action. During the coffee break, Carney's chief of staff pulled aside the communications director and uttered 6 fateful words. He's going to respond at the presser. The team immediately began preparations, but not for talking points, not a typical rebuttal, nor the standard diplomatic package for such a provocation. Instead, they prepared for something unprecedented at a G7 summit, a comedic moment. Carney had confided in his senior advisor during a private chat. Trump's comment had crystallized a decision he'd been mulling for months. The era of treating this president with the diplomatic respect due to his office was over. Why? Because the man in that office had repeatedly, publicly, and now in a G7 working session, demonstrated he extended no such respect to anyone else. Carney's decision wasn't to escalate, it was to demote. That distinction, he knew, made all the difference. Then came the press conference. It was the standard G7 setup, a gentle arc of podiums, each with a nation's flag and nameplate. The international press corps filled tiered seating. Cameras from every major network in the world zeroed in on the stage. The air was tense, but the routine was familiar. Everyone expected a carefully worded closing statement, diplomatic language meant to highlight agreement, and gracefully paper over the contentious disagreements. Trump spoke first, thanks to an alphabetical rotation rather than host prerogative. His remarks were typically self-congratulatory, declaring the summit a tremendous success, claiming credit for agreements settled long before he arrived, and boasting that other leaders were very impressed with America's achievements under his leadership. He completely omitted any reference to his earlier comments about Canada. He seemed to have moved on entirely, utterly oblivious that the fuse he had lit was still burning and about to ignite. Carney's turn came 40 minutes in. His opening remarks were, by all accounts, unremarkable. A summary of Canada's positions on climate, supply chains, and Arctic governance, delivered in his signature, measured, slightly dry diplomatic tone. He thanked the host, acknowledged productive discussions, even used the phrase constructive engagement twice. Nothing in his demeanor, tone, or language hinted at anything beyond a routine closing statement. The seasoned press corps, many covering summits for decades, displayed the glazed patience of professionals waiting for the Q&A, where actual news might actually break. Then, a Reuters journalist asked the question. Prime Minister Carney, President Trump suggested earlier today that Canada's role in global trade is insignificant. What is your response? The question was direct, yet entirely expected. Journalists regularly prompt leaders to respond to provocative statements, and the anticipated answer is always a dignified rebuttal, reaffirming strong bilateral relations and mutual respect. Carney paused, and it was a telling pause. Approximately 3 seconds long, just enough time for the press corps to glance up from their notebooks, for cameras to zoom in, for the other leaders on stage to shift their gaze towards him. He tilted his head slightly, the faintest hint of amusement, not a smile or a smirk, but a subtle shift in expression crossed his face. Those in the front row of journalists later said that was the moment they knew something unprecedented was coming. The president says Canada is too small to matter, Carney began, his tone conversational, almost gentle, the kind you'd use to describe something mildly puzzling, not deeply offensive. He paused again, a single second, perhaps 2, before delivering the punchline. And yet somehow, he spent 2 years talking about nothing else. The silence that followed lasted precisely 2 seconds. Then, the room broke. Laughter, genuine, uncontrolled, involuntary, erupted from the press corps, from the diplomatic staff lining the walls, and most devastatingly, from the other leaders on stage. Macron quickly turned his head from the cameras, but not fast enough to conceal his broad grin. MS closed his eyes, pressing his lips together in that universal struggle to stifle laughter, and failing spectacularly. The British Prime Minister looked down at her podium, shoulders visibly shaking. Japan's Prime Minister covered his mouth with his hand. The Italian Prime Minister, however, made no effort to hide his amusement, laughing openly and loudly directly into his microphone. Trump's face, caught by 6 cameras from 6 angles, told an unmistakable story. A flush of color surged from his collar to his forehead, a textbook involuntary humiliation response, as one body language expert later noted, the undeniable physiological signature of someone publicly diminished and acutely aware of it. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowed, hands gripping the sides of his podium. He didn't laugh, he didn't smile, he didn't even manage the performative amusement a more disciplined politician might use to diffuse the tension. He stood rigid, visibly furious, as the room roared with laughter around him. That stark contrast, Carney's calm, the room's mirth, Trump's seething rage, became the defining image not just of the summit, but of the entire trajectory of his international relationships. Carney didn't gloat. He didn't pause to relish the reaction. Instead, he instantly reverted to his measured, diplomatic tone, answered 2 more questions on Arctic policy and semiconductor cooperation, and concluded with a standard thank you to the host nation. This seamless return to professionalism was, in itself, devastating. It treated the mockery as unremarkable, as if publicly deriding the President of the United States was such a natural response to his behavior that it required no special acknowledgement, no dramatic follow-up, no hint that anything extraordinary had just transpired. The mockery wasn't the climax of his press conference, it was an aside. And that casualness conveyed something far more cutting than the words themselves. That Trump's behavior had made him so utterly mockable, it barely warranted a break in one's prepared remarks. Then, Trump responded. And his response did the only thing that could have made the moment worse. It proved Carney absolutely right. Within 30 minutes of the press conference ending, Trump unleashed a social media tirade, calling Carney a failed banker who couldn't run a lemonade stand, the worst leader in Canadian history, and a desperate, jealous little man from a country that would be nothing without the United States. He branded the laughing leaders weak and disrespectful, threatened immediate tariff increases on Canadian goods, and told reporters on the tarmac Carney was finished, and Canada will pay a very big price for what happened today. Every single word of his reaction confirmed the mockery's underlying thesis. Here was a leader utterly incapable of absorbing a moment of humor without erupting into such disproportionate rage that the original joke seemed not just funny, but prophetic. Carney's jab had whispered, "This man is too easily provoked to be taken seriously." Trump's outburst screamed, "Yes, exactly." Behind the scenes, the White House plunged into damage control, though the effort itself only amplified the harm. Senior advisors reportedly pleaded for restraint before the social media posts went live. One even told the president that the only way to beat a joke is to not react to it, and was overruled within minutes. The communications team scrambled, drafting 3 different official responses, each more measured than what the president eventually said, and each summarily rejected in favor of the unfiltered rage already unleashed. Staff members described the atmosphere within the traveling delegation as the worst I've seen in 2 years. Worse than the tariff backlash, worse than diplomatic severances, worse than anything. Because this, they knew, was deeply personal to him. Within hours of Trump's response, a second viral wave crashed. Side-by-side compilations pairing Carney's calm delivery with Trump's furious reaction, all set against the audio of the room's laughter, were edited into inescapable, brutal clips. These compilations spread even more widely than the original video because they delivered a complete, devastating narrative in under 30 seconds. Provocation, mockery, laughter, rage, confirmation. The internet had found its perfect story arc, and as it always does, it spread it everywhere, to everyone, cementing it permanently. Carney's structural trap was now fully exposed, and it was a trap with no escape. Silence in the face of the mockery would have appeared as submission, an unspoken acceptance of the joke's validity and the lack of any available comeback. Rage, conversely, served as confirmation, irrefutable proof that the characterization of Trump as easily provoked and unable to handle being laughed at was, indeed, accurate. A dignified, measured response would have demanded the very quality the entire confrontation was designed to highlight as absent: composure under social pressure. There simply was no good option, and this was by design. Carney hadn't just mocked Trump, he had engineered a situation where every conceivable response to the mockery only amplified its effectiveness. Silence, rage, or dignity, each path inexorably led to the same outcome, reinforcing the image of a leader who could not function on a stage where he wasn't feared. Now this is where the story transcends a mere viral moment and delves into something with permanent structural consequences. Because mockery wields a power over authority that no tariff, sanction, diplomatic severance, or trade war ever could. All previous weapons in this confrontation, the tariffs, the energy suspensions, the diplomatic ruptures, the bilateral deals designed to sideline American participation, primarily attacked American interests. They inflicted economic, strategic, and diplomatic damage, yes, but they largely left American authority intact. A nation can endure economic pain and still retain its standing. It can lose a trade war and remain respected. It can even lose an ally and maintain its place in the global hierarchy. But what a nation, what no leader, what no institution can ever fully recover from, is becoming a joke. Jokes don't target your interests, they target your gravity. And gravity, that indispensable perception that you are serious, consequential, that your words carry weight and your threats carry meaning, is the invisible foundation upon which all authority is built. From a distance, defiance and mockery might look similar, but their implications are structurally polar opposites. When Carney imposed tariffs, he was in effect saying, "I take you seriously enough to fight you." When he forged alternative trade architectures with Germany, he was communicating, "I take you seriously enough to prepare for a future without you." When diplomatic relations were severed, the message was, "I take you seriously enough to accept the cost of separation." Every previous aggressive action implicitly acknowledged the United States as a serious actor whose power demanded a serious response. But the mockery? It fundamentally withdrew that acknowledgement. It declared, "You are no longer worth a serious response." And that withdrawal, that demotion from adversary to punchline, is far more devastating than any economic measure, because economic measures can be reversed. Demotions of perceived stature cannot. Warren Buffett, with his characteristic directness, addressed the one dimension of this moment that virtually no one in the political conversation was daring to touch. What happens to power when its wielder becomes an object of ridicule, and why that damage is uniquely, structurally, and permanently irreversible. In 70 years of business, Buffett explained, I've learned there are two kinds of damage a leader can suffer. First, competitive damage. You lose a deal, a market, a negotiation. This is serious but recoverable. You regroup, restructure, come back with a better offer, a better strategy, a better team. Careers and companies bounce back from competitive damage every single day. But, he continued, the second kind of damage is reputational damage through ridicule. And in 70 years, I have never seen anyone recover from it. Not once. Because ridicule doesn't attack what you do, it attacks what you are. Once the world decides you are funny, no amount of success, no amount of money, no amount of power can ever make them decide you are serious again. Buffett applied this directly to the G7 moment, with the piercing clarity that has defined his public commentary for decades. Every leader in that room now carries a lived, visceral, physical memory of laughing at the President of the United States, he stated. That memory doesn't fade when tariffs shift. It doesn't vanish when trade numbers improve. It doesn't evaporate with the next summit's carefully worded communique about shared values. It sits in the back of their minds, and more profoundly, in their gut, because laughter is a gut response. And it changes the calculus of every future interaction. You negotiate differently with someone you've laughed at. You concede less. You push back more. You take their threats less seriously, not consciously, not strategically, but instinctively, because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. And what those leaders' bodies remember is the feeling of laughing at a man who was trying to intimidate them. He paused. That, Buffett concluded, is the most expensive 13 seconds in the history of American diplomacy, and the cost will compound for years. Buffett delved further into this irreversibility principle, offering a business parallel that silenced the room. I once watched a CEO, he recounted, a brilliant operator, genuinely talented, utterly destroy his authority at an industry conference. Not through a bad decision, not a scandal, but through a single moment where he tried to assert dominance over a panel, and the panel made him look foolish. The audience laughed, the video spread, and within 6 months he couldn't enter a negotiation without the other side having seen that clip. His proposals were sound, his numbers were right, his strategy was correct, and none of it mattered. Because the people across the table couldn't look at him without remembering the laughter. He was removed by his board 14 months later. Not for performance, which was perfectly fine, but because the board concluded his ability to command a room had been permanently compromised. That's what ridicule does, Buffett stressed. It doesn't change your capabilities, it changes everyone else's willingness to be moved by them. He tied it back to the very structural foundation of power. Authority requires gravitas. Gravitas is the perception that you are serious, that when you speak, the room should listen, that when you threaten, the threat is real, that when you make a demand, it carries weight. Gravitas isn't something you claim, it's something others grant you, based on a feeling, the feeling that this person is consequential, that engaging with them demands your full attention, that dismissing them would be a profound mistake. Ridicule, he concluded, is the precise and permanent negation of that feeling. You cannot be both a punchline and a figure of gravitas. The two are structurally incompatible, and once the footage exists, once that laughter has been recorded, broadcast, shared, memed, remixed, and embedded into the cultural memory of an entire generation of diplomats, journalists, and world leaders, the gravitas doesn't come back. Not in this news cycle, not in the next summit, not ever. His closing statement, just 3 sentences, landed with the undeniable weight of a career dedicated to understanding the true nature of authority, what builds it and what shatters it. You can recover from being beaten. You can recover from being hated. You cannot recover from being funny. He let the silence hang because, as he implicitly understood, funny follows you into every room for the rest of your life. The footage, of course, continued to spread, and as it did, it ceased to be just a moment. It became a permanent fixture in how the world perceived the American presidency. The clip garnered 90 million views in its first 12 hours, surging past 300 million within a week. It shattered records, becoming the most shared piece of political footage in the history of every major social media platform, eclipsing election night coverage, State of the Union addresses, and all previous viral political clips by a factor of 4. The memes were immediate, relentless, and wildly creative. Trump's frozen, humiliated expression photoshopped into countless scenes of historical embarrassment, Carney's delivery remixed with comedic timing annotations, side-by-side compilations of the mockery and the rage, set to increasingly absurd soundtracks. Late-night hosts across the US, UK, France, Germany, Australia, and Japan all opened their shows with the clip. Editorial pages in 14 countries seized upon it as the centerpiece for their analyses of American decline. Yet the diplomatic consequences, though less visible, proved far more profound than any viral metric. Within a 72-hour window, 3 ambassadors from allied nations independently told the same reporter, in off-the-record conversations, that something shifted after that press conference. One called it the end of performative deference, that deeply ingrained diplomatic practice of treating American positions with a seriousness often unwarranted by their content, maintained purely out of respect for American power. That deference, the ambassador explained, was no longer instinctive. Another described it as the moment the emperor's new clothes dynamic finally broke, when everyone in the room already knew the truth, but the laughter was the first time anyone acknowledged it publicly. And once acknowledged, it could not be unacknowledged. A third ambassador put it simply, "We used to prepare for meetings with the Americans like we were meeting a powerful client. Now we prepare for meetings with the Americans like we're meeting a difficult relative." The power dynamic hasn't changed on paper, it has changed in the room. Specific diplomatic fallout was measurable within days. 2 planned bilateral summits between the US and allied nations were quietly downgraded from presidential-level meetings to ministerial consultations. A demotion in diplomatic protocol that signaled, without ever explicitly stating it, that the head of state relationship had been damaged. Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement so meticulously worded that its very restraint became the message. Japan values the G7 as a forum for constructive dialogue among democratic partners and trusts that all participants share this commitment. The conspicuous absence of any language referencing American leadership, which would have been automatic in any previous era, was immediately noted by every diplomatic correspondent in the region. Most tellingly, the European Commission president, in an interview with a German newspaper, uttered something that diplomats across the continent recognized as the most significant shift in transatlantic rhetoric in a generation. Europe's relationship with the United States is important, but importance is not the same as deference, and this week reminded us of the difference. Those 3 words, importance is not deference, became the quiet motto of a diplomatic realignment that had been building for 2 years, and which the laughter at that press conference had finally made speakable. Domestically, American politics absorbed the moment along predictable yet intensifying fault lines. Conservative media outlets furiously attacked Carney as disrespectful, undiplomatic, and a failed central banker who has no business lecturing the leader of the free world. Liberal media, predictably, played the clip on continuous rotation, framing it as the international community finally saying aloud what American critics had whispered for years. But the most revealing reactions emerged from the political center. From the strategists, the foreign policy professionals, the former diplomats and intelligence officials who operate outside partisan frameworks. A former Secretary of State, speaking on background, observed, "The laughter is the metric. When allies are angry at you, you still have leverage because anger means they're engaged. When allies are mocking you, you've lost something leverage can't replace, the assumption that you're worth engaging with seriously." A Republican foreign policy advisor who had served 3 previous administrations lamented, "I've spent 30 years building relationships with allied governments on the premise that American leadership matters and deserves respect. That premise took 13 seconds to destroy and will take a generation to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all." Polling conducted within 5 days revealed a stunning 68% of Americans had seen the clip, a penetration rate exceeding every major political event of the previous 2 years combined, including the State of the Union, midterm election results, and every presidential press conference. Of those who saw it, 52% believed the mockery was deserved, given the president's behavior at the summit. 31% found it inappropriate, regardless of provocation, and 14% admitted they found it funny, but concerning for America's global image. The most striking figure came from independent voters. 58% said the clip made them less confident in America's standing in the world. Not because they blamed Carney, but because they recognized that a nation whose president is laughed at by its own allies has a credibility problem that transcends any single policy or personality. This footage had achieved something that 2 years of trade war coverage, diplomatic analyses, and economic data never could. It made the abstract concept of declining American authority viscerally, visually, and emotionally real. Business leaders, too, began to weigh in, amplifying the damage into economic dimensions the White House hadn't even considered. The CEO of a major American multinational with significant European operations told the Financial Times, "When I'm negotiating with European partners, and they've all seen the footage of their leaders laughing at our president, the dynamic in the room is different, not hostile, amused." And, he added, amused is worse than hostile, because hostile means they're taking you seriously. A prominent Wall Street strategist, in a client note, bluntly declared, "Geopolitical risk is now geopolitical comedy risk." This clip, he argued, introduced a new variable into every international deal involving American entities. The fundamental question of whether American authority still carries its former weight, or if the G7 laughter represents a permanent discount on American credibility. You can argue about trade balances, you can debate tariff policy, but you cannot debate a room full of world leaders laughing. So here's where we stand. Mark Carney stood at a G7 press conference podium, facing every major world leader and the international press corps, and publicly mocked the President of the United States. His line was so precisely constructed that the room erupted in laughter, and the footage went viral within hours. Trump's response, a torrent of rage, personal attacks, and retaliatory threats, confirmed every implication of the mockery, triggering a second, even more damaging viral wave. The footage has now been viewed over 300 million times. Allied diplomats report a permanent shift in how they engage with the United States. American foreign policy professionals from across the political spectrum acknowledge that something irreplaceable was lost in those 13 seconds, something policy alone cannot rebuild. And Warren Buffett articulated why. Because ridicule utterly destroys gravitas. And gravitas, he reminds us, is the invisible infrastructure upon which all authority rests. Once that footage exists, once the laughter has been recorded, gravitas simply does not come back. Can a president truly negotiate from a position of strength with leaders who have laughed at him on camera? Leaders who know that footage will haunt every future summit, every bilateral meeting, every phone call for the remainder of his term? Can American diplomatic authority ever recover from the moment it became a punchline, not in opposition media, not in hostile propaganda, but in the actual room where the world's democracies conduct their most serious business? And here's the unsettling question for every American who understands that global leadership hinges on perception as much as power. What happens to a nation's influence when the world stops being afraid of its leader and starts being amused by him? Trump attempted to dominate the G7 through pure intimidation. Instead, he became the unwitting subject of its laughter. He tried to diminish Carney by branding Canada as irrelevant. Instead, he handed Carney the perfect setup and the ideal stage for the most devastating 13 seconds in modern diplomatic history. He sought to project strength. Instead, he exposed the one fatal flaw strength cannot survive. The visible, recorded, viral moment when every leader in that room decided he was funny rather than fearsome. And Carney? He delivered 19 words that will outlast this presidency, outlast this trade war, and outlast every tariff and counter-tariff either side has imposed. 19 words every leader in that room heard, every diplomat in the world has now watched, and which the internet will never, ever allow to be forgotten. The president says Canada is too small to matter, and yet somehow he spent 2 years talking about nothing else.